Hello everyone, my name is Greg Hussey. I am a member of the East Hants Historical Society, and this is a presentation in regards to the First World War and its records that you can access if you had a Canadian relative who fought in the war. This will give you a brief overview of how a soldier would have lived and also of how to interpret those records. So a bit of a review. So prior to 1914, France, Russia, and Britain were allied with each other. Germany and Austria-Hungary were aligned with each other, and generally there was high political tension throughout Europe. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia. He was projected to be the next Austro-Hungarian emperor. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and ultimately, through negotiation, had declared war on them on July 28th. Russia had an alliance with Serbia and backed them up. Germany backed up Austria-Hungary, and ultimately Germany would declare war on Russia and France as a means to protect Austria-Hungary and a way to avoid a two-front war on the German front. And the British Empire got into the war by Germany invading Belgium, who was neutral at the time, and the British Empire declared war because of their invasion of Belgium. So there was more than just Flanders when it came to the First World War. There was also various other fronts. Many of these fronts were actually very mountainous and very rough terrain, and certainly lots of soldiers had lots of hard times dealing with those situations, and the amount of casualties in those other fronts was just as staggering as the Western Front, if not more. Now, Canada in August 1914 was automatically at war because of the British Empire being at war and them being part of the British Empire at the time. So upon Canada becoming ingrained in this war, they instituted something called the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and part of that they made numbered battalions. There were various numbers as it went up. Some of them did have names, but they were also numbered as well. Now, some other battalions that weren't numbered that were named was the Royal Canadian Regiment, based out of Halifax, and Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry was a battalion specifically made up for the First World War. And ultimately, the Princess Patricias were the actual 1st Canadian Battalion to set foot in the trenches of France, and they set foot on January 7th, 1915. Now, Canada had various other support units besides infantry, because you have to think that a military at this time basically functions as a small society. So anything that you may need in a small society, the military would have to provide. This shows an example of a photo of likely an ammunition column, which was men assigned with providing ammunition to the front line up at the front. And you can see here it's made so that there is a rail car here as well. And here you can see an example of a lumber camp, which was part of their forestry corps. And they even had a cyclist corps. Now, Nova Scotia was also part of this and instituted numbered battalions. So you can see on the right there the number of battalions which were formed in Nova Scotia or had recruited in Nova Scotia. So prior to the war, Nova Scotia primarily had local militias. They had instituted 11 numbered infantry battalions, but there was only 2 that actually served in the actual fields. The others were amalgamated or absorbed into a reserve battalion. So as an example, the 40th and the 17th were both designated as reserve battalions eventually. So because they were absorbed or amalgamated, men weren't necessarily destined to be in a Nova Scotia battalion just because they joined one. There were various other units that Nova Scotia had used. Most of these, as you can see, are artillery type units, with the exception of the 6 Canadian Mounted Rifles, which would have been a mounted battalion, so primarily the use of horse. Most of these ultimately did not actually be mounted in the field. It was determined very early on that we were well beyond the time where cavalry charges were necessary and used. There was also the number 2 Construction Battalion, which is known as the Black Battalion, and was primarily made up of black recruits. A lot of these recruits came from all over Nova Scotia. There was the number 1 Canadian Casualty Clearing Station, the Canadian Stationary Hospital, the number 7 and the number 9. Now these were actually instituted by those respective universities and recruited men from those universities or students who were becoming doctors or something in the medical profession. So why would you want to join the war anyway? So for the most part, it was to break the monotony. Many people, they were given a free opportunity to travel. An average person would work on a farm, work on a mine, fishing, lumbering, something like that. And most people then had worked from the age of 14 until they were worn out. There was also religious reasons. There was public shaming, which could happen if you didn't join. It could raise your social standing. So maybe you go as an ordinary citizen and you come out and you're promoted to a sergeant. Well, maybe your skills and your experiences during the war has gotten a better job when you come back. A lot of times it was a better pay than the normal occupation. You were given 3 meals a day, and you could be with your friends and relatives and travel the world, as I said. There was a lot of Canadians that also had British ancestry, and they felt an obligation to go and actually serve and protect England in that sense. Now, Canada did institute conscription, which was the forced act of military service. So they officially passed this on August 29th, 1917, under the Military Service Act. So males between the ages of 20 and 45 were obligated to register for military service. You could be exempt due to an essential service job, marital status, or family. The 1st Depot Battalion, Nova Scotia Regiment, was authorized for the draftees. Many men actually did not leave Nova Scotia and remained here. They just stayed in a depot battalion, could resume their normal jobs, but they were in that depot battalion if they got called up. For those that did leave, a lot remained in England, never went to France or Belgium. And those sent to France and Belgium were often sent after the armistice. Now, when you open up a military file, and we'll start to get into these now, if you see this, either through their attestation or somewhere in their paperwork, if you see this where it says particulars of recruit and drafted under Military Service Act, that means that person in particular was conscripted. Now, some locations you may see in your ventures as you go through these records, you'll commonly find different locations. Halifax had the armories, the York Redoubt, McNabb's Island. There was Aldershot, Nova Scotia, it still exists, training grounds. Sussex, New Brunswick had a military camp. Amherst had a local militia, and there was also a prisoner of war camp there. Truro had a militia, New Glasgow had a militia. There was also Valcartier, Quebec. Valcartier, Quebec was specifically designed to train Canadian Expeditionary Force training grounds. And so you'll see a lot of early recruits from 1914, 1915 go here to train. Once in England, a common spot was in Bramshot, England, which was the Commonwealth Forces training ground. So you'd see British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealanders, African or South African and other African countries as well. Same with Shorncliffe, you'd see that. Aldershot, just the same. Farnborough, same. And La Haye, France was another spot. So once men would get transferred to France, often they would assemble in La Haye, France, which is one of the port cities, and easy transport to England. And finally, another place that was common was Boulogne, also another coastal town, similar reasons, easy to get across the channel. So as an infantry trench routine, often a battalion would spend 5 to 7 days in the trench, then in a rest period or placed in a reserve. You could spend upwards to a month or two training and actually out of the trenches, so it's a misnomer that men were continually in the trenches during the whole time during the war. That's incorrect. You could spend weeks traveling by train or marching to new areas. Large attacks, so your big attacks such as Vimy, Passchendaele, Hill 70, Canal du Nord, those battles, a lot of those, the big ones that you see, they had occurred usually at dusk or dawn. Most of the time it would be at dawn, early morning hours, 4 or 5 a.m. And that was just mainly to use as a method so that you'd have a little bit of light, but you wouldn't have enough light that you're not going to be completely mowed down. Oftentimes at night, there was men on guard duty. There was some sleeping. Others were crawling in no man's land or above trench in cover of darkness to work. So you have to think all these men are out in the field. You know, there's people who are injured. There's people who are dead and need to be buried, or maybe they need to lay wire, or there would also be, as I put here, small raids would occur at the night by small raiding parties. And so these can all occur at nighttime often because of the cover of darkness. This is what you'll see here is a common trench map, and this is a basics of how a trench would operate. So there was often a frontline trench, so main fire trenches, as you can see in the front, and in between those trenches would be called communication trenches. So it's not necessarily for communication, it's to transfer troops from a further trench in behind to the main front trench in the front. So you'd see here they'd have the main firing trench, they have a support trench, and then they would have a reserve trench as well. So, and then they may have dummy trenches as well to trick artillery fire, or various kind of trenches to distract the enemy essentially. You may also have dugouts in here as well, little caves in the side of the trench to seek shelter in there. And you can see all these trenches, they're trying to replicate that they're zigzagged, and the reason why they were zigzagged is simply because if an artillery shell fell in one of these areas, the hope is that because it's zigzagged, it's not going to blow a piece of shrapnel straight down a trench and kill hundreds of people. Instead, it will lodge itself into the side of the trench. So how do you start with your records? Well, you begin with a name, and I always suggest to grab a pen and a paper. So we're going to use the example of a James Dalrymple. So known information we know about James, well, we know his name. And we know he was born around 1880 in the Minesville area. So if you don't have any known information, try seeking census records, vital stats, or family histories. Knowing given parents' names or birthplace can help. And as a side note, Second World War records are not yet disclosed publicly due to privacy. You can, however, make an application if you are a relative and can prove their death. Newfoundland records are British held because Newfoundland was a British colony at that time. And there are Boer War records online, but they are much less detailed than First World War records and seem to be pretty sparse. So your main database that you're going to use is Library and Archives Canada. Now, Library and Archives Canada makes it pretty easy for you to search. However, again, it is transcribed, so you have to be mindful that there are errors, and just because you think something's spelled a certain way, they might not have it that way. So this is the screen you'll get. The red box is just an easy way you can do things because you can just type in the person's name. So if you typed in James Dalrymple, you're going to come up with this. Now it's going to populate specifically what you want it is, James Dalrymple, or it may also populate a middle name as it is on the bottom there with Robert James Dalrymple. Now you'll notice here that there are dates of birth and there are regimental numbers here and also a rank. Now that won't always be there. The regimental numbers should be there. If a regimental number isn't there, such as the top one, then that's oftentimes they were commissioned and they don't necessarily have a regimental number assigned because they were an officer. So you got two close dates here. So you have to kind of open one up and see which one could be which. Now if we open up Whitney Dalrymple, this is what you'll find. When you click on the file, there'll be various options on the bottom. And this would be his attestation paper, which is essentially his recruitment paper of how he would have signed up. On this paper, it's going to show that his name is James. It says before James Whitney, but I would say it'd be James Whitman. Born in Minesville. He's got his name of the next of kin here. It's a Captain A.J. Dalrymple who lives in Truro. He's going to show his date of birth, his occupation at the time of enlistment, his marital status, were they ever part of a militia or had served in the military. And as you can hear, he said he did. So he spent time with the Rocky Mountain Rangers. So he probably was out west at one point because the Rocky Mountain Rangers is a militia that is based out in Alberta. You'll often see many men were actually in militias, or they served in the Boer War, or also known as the South African War. You may see this as well. Same sheet, looking down, you'll see his signature, you'll see his date of enlistment, where they enlisted, the Justice of the Peace signing the application, the officer's signature, and interestingly enough, on this page, you actually have a stamp that shows that he was in the 40th Battalion, so you can see there, it looks like COM, meaning Commander of the 40th, and that's an illegible, the next one, but it says CEF, Canadian Expeditionary Force, so likely he was in the 40th Battalion, which would make sense considering it's a Nova Scotia-based battalion. On the back of this paper, you'll get some personal details about this person, so you'll get their age, their height, their chest girth when expanded, skin complexion, eye color, hair color, religion, and any distinctive markings if they had. It's noted here that James actually doesn't. And interesting to note here too is that James is actually a pretty old, quote-unquote, old recruit for that time. He's actually 36 and 10 months, so he's almost 37 when he joins, which is quite different for that time. Not many men actually did join at that age. They were usually in their 20s, if not their late teens. So you'll go back, and this is just the beginning of his file. You want to click this PDF. When you click this PDF, it'll prompt you to load a PDF file. It may take a few minutes to load, depending on the size of the file. There are absolutely no rhyme or reason to the way that this file is organized. It is all over the place, hence why I say to get a pen and a paper, because you'll be writing things down and it won't make sense at first until you organize it. This is the first item you'll usually see on a piece of paper, on this file, sorry, and it will be that attestation paper. It may be a different copy, it may be the exact same copy, so it's always good to compare notes between these two because there may be some differences in them. Or you may get a brown craft envelope such as this. They literally sometimes scan the entire file, wrinkles and all, and this is what you will get. Now, when you open your file, there's a lot of things in the file that aren't necessarily useful. They can be useful, but your main data is going to be on a page similar to this. So we're going to break this down and note it all, and then we will fill in the gaps. So at the top of the page here, you're going to see his name, James, and now it says Whitney, but you can see it's recorded or fixed here as Whitman. At one time he attained the rank of sergeant, as you can note on the far left where it says SGT. He was with the 25th Battalion at some point, because you can see 25th at the right in the center at the top. And we already know that he was probably recruited into the 14th, or sorry, the 40th, and it says here also he had served with the 17th. Now, if you break down these actual dates, you can actually see the date he arrived in England. He arrived at Shorncliffe, which was the training grounds. He was taken on strength, which means transferred to the 17th Battalion. You can see when he embarked to go to France, and he actually embarked to go to France to join the 25th Battalion. And then you can see when he joined the 25th. And you can also see he was appointed as a Lance Corporal. Again, going down further down the sheet, he was then appointed a Lance Sergeant. He was appointed an Acting Sergeant with pay. He reverted to a Lance Sergeant. He was admitted to the number 16 General Hospital. Now, it doesn't give you the context as to what had happened here, but it gives you the opportunity for further research, which may be in other parts of this record. Again, continuing down the record, he was promoted to a sergeant. Presumably he was still in hospital at this point. He was transferred to the CCAC, which is an acronym. This is usually full of acronyms, so in this case it is the Canadian Casualty Assembly Centre, which is in Folkestone, England. He was transferred to the 2nd Western General Hospital in Manchester. And it looks like he was again transferred to another Canadian Casualty Assembly Centre, possibly in southern England. And you can see here as a circle, there's a GSW somewhere. So presumably, that could be a hint. Remember that later. So then he was transferred to the Canadian Convalescent Hospital in Epsom, England. Transferred to the 26th Canadian Reserve Battalion, which was usually a battalion used to pool men for transitioning back to the front lines. SOS means removed from the battalion. In this case, he was removed to rejoin the 25th, so he presumably had healed. He rejoined the 25th, and then unfortunately for him, he was actually killed in action. These are some other examples of things that you'll find in the file. It may give you more information, and it may be different information than what you had seen previously in those previous pages. Again, this is a very similar thing. There may be more detail in here though, and it may be more legible if it was put on a typewriter. This is a little casualty card you'll see. So in here you'll get his brother-in-law actually, so you got another family member. You get his address of his brother-in-law, what port they sailed from to reach England, name of the ship they sailed to England, and this is just an example of a portion of a medical file. So it can include heart rate and temperature, wound care, psychological treatment, discharges due to ailment or injury, details of a death or injury. It can show venereal disease, and a lot of men were actually ill when they went over. It was very rare for, as you go through the records, to see a man who actually did not have some kind of ailment while he was there, either through injury from an actual war wound or war, something to do with that, or a sickness. Now, remember that GSW acronym, well, GSW stands for gunshot wound. So that's why James was actually in the hospital, and as you can see here, it says GSW upper arm. So you're getting some close detail here as to exactly why he was in the hospital at that point. So presumably he was shot in some kind of combat and in the upper arm. These are some other acronyms you'll see. So I already explained GSW, gunshot wound. SWLC is shrapnel wound. This is another piece of his record, and again, it's more of a casualty thing. So you will see on here if he had any medals or decorations and where they were presented to and the date they were presented. You also see when his plaque and scroll, and we'll get to that later of what that is. And you can see here it's actually got his brother's name here, and there was a Joseph Dalrymple, and he lived in Bridgetown, Nova Scotia. Now, plaques and scrolls and a memorial cross was only given if the person had died in service. Not every person had gotten those. This is what the scroll looked like, and this is what a memorial plaque also looked like, and this was also known as the death penny. These were common medals that most soldiers got in the First World War, especially the middle and the far right. Any soldier who served overseas would have gotten those two. The one on the far left, the 1914-15 star, were only given to men who actually served on the front lines in 1915. Here are some other examples of medical records. A lot of these files are medical records or pays. So you'll often get pay allowances, dental records, you'll get some basic wills in here, gratuities or banking information. So it may say who they bank with, it may say who their insurance plan is with, etc., etc. Now, if a person had died, one thing you can do is go on this database here, which is again through Library and Archives Canada. It's not as easy to navigate as the previous search and click. You have to actually go by slide and try to find your actual person. And as you can see here, it's all in alphabetical order, and they have it listed by name, so you have to find your person's name in between those letters. So in this case, we'll look up James Whitman Dalrymple, and you can see the exact circumstances here as to how he died. So this presumably would have been witnessed by one of his comrades or an officer or something to that extent. Sometimes these will just plainly say killed in action. You might not get any detail, or you might get a situation like this where there is actually quite a bit of detail. and it will show the cemetery that he's buried at and relative directions of how to attend that cemetery. And you'll actually get his date of a casualty here. So in this case, it was May 4th, 1917. And at that time, it's likely that the 25th Battalion was actually engaged in the Battle of Arlo, which was a battle that, after the Vimy Ridge battle, kind of exploiting their successes from that battle. Now, you can go on the Canadian Virtual War Memorial. This is also again for only the soldiers who died in combat. Now, this site can be used for any military member or RCMP member who has died in service in Canada's history from 1867 to present. So you can look up James on here. James will come up. It shows his date of death. And when you pull it up, this is what you'll get. So again, on the bottom, you'll get a description of the cemetery he's at, the reference of where his grave is, and a better description of how to actually get to the cemetery. And you can see here that you've got some more information here. So now you've got Captain Alfred T. Dalrymple and Bessie Dalrymple of Minersville. And you can actually download a copy of the Book of Remembrance page that he would be remembered on. Now, the Book of Remembrance is a remembrance book that is located in Ottawa. They have one for the large conflicts. I know at least they have one for the First and Second World War. I don't know about the other ones. But the men who died in those wars are commemorated on this book. Also on this site, you may find grave photos, you can find personal photos, newspaper extracts, letters, various things. And this is what a Book of Remembrance is going to look like that is in Ottawa. So again, you can get a high resolution copy of this to print at home, or you can actually order a copy from the federal government and they will mail it to you. Another way you can look at some people who were in a battalion is you can look at nominal rolls. Now, nominal rolls were basically a list of all the men who had originally enlisted for that particular battalion and maybe in those subsequent drafts as well. Now, it's not a guarantee that that person is going to be on this list because they may have not been originally recruited in that list, and some of the nominal rolls don't necessarily include everyone. And at the bottom of these nominal rolls, you can see that there's actually, it'll show where these ships had left and what port they left on and the name of the ship. So it'll show the original men recruited. Officers are commissioned at the first. You'll see those men they're commissioned. Usually they're commissioned on enlistment. It's usually due to his social status, education, or profession. Very much that type of society then, where status did mean something. Other ranks are common. You'll see ORs. Other ranks are non-officers, so that's your ordinary soldier or a private. You'll see the subsequent draft as I had stated, so that's when the battalion goes for its second or third or fourth recruitment drive to get more men to send over. Again, you'll get your ship name, departure dates, and this is the nominal roll of the 40th Battalion, and James is listed here, and he originally listed as a private, so eventually before his death he was a sergeant, so he did earn those stripes in some fashion. So when you write it all down, this is what you will get in terms of James's war biography. Now that's only a start to what you can do. You can actually go beyond that, and you can go on a website where you can view war diaries of basically any battalion. For the most part, most battalions are on here, and you can basically look at what they did every day at the duration of the war that they were there. So you're going to go up to this box here. In this case, James was part of the 25th for the majority of his military career, and that's where the bread and butter of his career would have been. So we're going to start there, looking at January 1916. This is what you'll commonly get. Now, depending on the person and how well you can read that, that could be quite gibberish to somebody and what they're doing. Again, there's no rhyme or reason as to how they were written. Different scribes had different ways. They had different acronyms, different penmanship, obviously. Sometimes these were typewritered, sometimes these were handwritten. So if you were to translate that, as I transcribed, this is what you'll commonly get. It may be detailed, it may not be. So it can be as little as a big battle, or you can get something as easy as kit inspection or just training. These are some other examples. Now when you see sent to the lines, they're referring to the front lines here. And working parties, so commonly if a battalion was in behind the lines, they would send a certain amount of men that would volunteer to go forward, or voluntold possibly to go forward, and okay, you're going to be assigned to do this laborious task tonight with other men, and possibly, like I said previously, dig trenches, fix up trenches, maybe lay down sandbags, wire, communication lines, different things like that. Also too, you'll get places where they may have been. Now commonly in these war diaries, you'll commonly see other nicknames for things. They weren't necessarily used by their actual names, so you'll see things here like rum jar, moaning minnie, what was a minenwerfer, a fishtail, potato masher, which was a steel hand grenade, and which was basically what you'll see there on the far right, which was the German version of a hand grenade. So basically it was leverage enough to throw it and it would explode. Whiz bang, which is a flying shell, and Mills bomb, which was a British grenade. So you'll see some examples here of it. You may also get some supplemental records at the bottom of these besides the day-by-day account. So you may get some correspondence between different officers, or what is going to go on in communications. Now another useful source specifically for Nova Scotia is the Highland Battalion photo diaries. So there were 4 battalions in Nova Scotia that actually made these. Sorry, 5. And when you go in them, they should have actual photos of the original men who joined those battalions. So here's an example of what you'll get as commonly on those pages when you open those up. And this is in a snippet of the 193rd. The 193rd was predominantly recruited in and around East Hanson, the Truro area. And lo and behold, you'll find someone here from Milford. So you'll get Private L.H. Wickwire. I didn't actually look at what his actual full name is, but that is a photo of him. Another useful tool is the McMaster University Mapping Program. And this is a program in which you can basically search a trench name and it will populate a map or an approximate location of where this trench may have been. So you'll often see that in the war diaries that they've occupied such and such trench. And if you take that, you may be able to type that in here and pinpoint where that battalion may have been at that time. So, and trenches were named all kinds of things. You have to think these were nicknames or nothing they might not even be serious at all. There were a series of trench that were named different cities in Western Canada, for example. You know, there was Vancouver Trench, there was Winnipeg Trench, there was Regina Trench, just as some things were. This is an example of Bulgar Trench. Now, there were, obviously you can see there were multiple Bulgar trenches, but specifically this Bulgar Trench I'm going to look at is in Beaumont, which is near a commune in France. So when I open up a map, it's actually going to show this, and so it will outline of where that trench is. So you can see Bulgar Trench is here. It's just outside of this commune here, and you can see the zigzags here. That's indicating those actual trenches, and again you can see those middle trenches in between those communication trenches. Now these probably would have been transcribed off of aerial reconnaissance photos and put on a map so you could overlay it with other things. Noteworthy here to look at the cemetery, because the cemetery appears to be on a crossroad, and it appears to be kind of a triangular shape. So this is the same area in today. So this is literally a Google map view of this exact same area. Now remember that cemetery that we looked at here, the triangular shape, and it's between two crossroads. Well, there it is. And if you go back on our map, you can see that Bulgar Trench was just to the right of the map of that cemetery. So it's very likely that Bulgar Trench was probably around here, which is now a farmer's field, and probably was before the battle too. This is some more examples of a battalion diary, and you can actually see here where it gets into more detail about an actual battle. So in this case, 25th had participated in the Battle of St. Eloi, which were literally a battle over different mine craters. And you can see here there's some other interesting things that you'll see. So they had bathing parades, which is literally men lined up and bathed. They didn't get to bathe obviously every day, or maybe it could have been weeks on end. They often had church, and the common theme was battalion sports and other various competitions. As you can see here, they had a machine gun section competition, and there was also a concert that held that day as well. Just an example of a photograph of what men would do behind the front lines. You could also be visited by higher-ups in society, such as the king, and they may also be accompanied by other military officials. Robert Borden made quite a few visits over to the front lines and commonly inspected troops. Here's a photo of him giving a speech on Dominion Day, or Canada Day as we now know it. And here's an example of a troop concert, which was behind the front lines. Now, it was not all mud and bullets. So this is an excerpt from a diary. I can't remember which one it was, but as you can see here, so arrangements have been made to obtain 7 acres of land at Les Brebis, which will be cultivated by the brigade and planted in potatoes. So you can see here they also supplemented their normal ration supply with actual vegetables. This is just another photo of men. Again, not really their rifle type action, whereas opposed to, in this case, they're digging, constructing a trench, kind of a shovel and pick type situation here. Very laborious. Now, you have to think it just wasn't the soldiers who endured this type of thing in the war itself. You have to think that they were fighting this war in France and Belgium in the Flanders region, which is a rural region And the citizens faced just as much turmoil, if not more, than the actual soldiers fighting this war. Remember, they didn't necessarily want the war. The citizens are being forced out of their homes by the Germans, and then later on, the actual French and Belgians, and the other allies, because when soldiers were building, the locals were actually forced to house soldiers in homes or their barns. Now, some may have liked this, some may have not. We're all human in the end. Much of the land fought over was all private property. It was with rural farms and small communes in there. So you have to think that, you have a field of wheat or corn or something. When the war was first declared in August of 1914, all these crops would have been growing or, getting ready to harvest. And then all of a sudden you're having this war happen. And as you can see by much of the photos, the earth was very churned up, and this basically put people's lives on pause for 4 years. So there was a lot of different aspects of the war than just looking at the soldiers who fought it. There was also the victims of the people of the land.